Okay.
All right. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us and our intersubjective dialogue here. And I'm going to start a little bit just with what my relationship is with what we do together here. So, I've been thinking about how this is different than other forms of dialogue. And, this intersubjectivity, it means it's not objective, it's not subjective. But, when you think about the head relates to objects as separate. And, we're a separate subject that looks at separate objects. And so the head can only talk about things. And that's usually what we do. We usually collect knowledge and we talk about things. And we're all pretty masterful at that. But there's a different way of communicating. When the heart is emptied of concepts, it has the capacity to come from a state of awareness that's no longer objective. And so my experience of what we really delight in doing together is that we commune, and it's kind of an effortless communing from an inner state of being with others that are coming from and sharing in this same state. So it's like we gather in this unitive state. So usually, although I wasn't very effective at it tonight, I had too much going on, but I try to empty my mind and kind of idle the senses and show up instead as a conscious presence where I'm aware of the objective figures of everyone here. And Zoom leads itself quite well to that, because I'm looking at Lorie and Lonny and Alexander and Vansanthi and Will and Randine. And so in this awareing presence, we're all together in this state, but I don't lose myself in this state either. So I think of being rooted in Shen together, not as a group of little beings with a whole lot of expertise that we're going to share, but as this unified field where we're all joined. And we all have access to a knowledge base that we draw upon, but that's in the background. It's not in the foreground. And the place that we meet is more like a field of overflowing. And so in describing it, it's like a felt sense of a superconscious state that's beyond the senses, but includes all of the senses, where we kind of become one mind, one heart, although each of us is touched during these dialogues in a very genuine way. And then it's as if the field responds through each of us, through each voice. And, as we commune, as we share, these ideas that come up, it's like they're presented and dropped in, and these ideas create kind of a ripple in this field. And so I'm not just a participant that's listening to what's being said as I'm thinking of what I'm going to say next. Not at all. It's like I'm given over to something bigger, to this receptivity itself. And my whole being takes in what's being said, along with this whole field of resonance. And it might sound like we get lost in it, but it's quite the opposite. It's a full apprehension. And it can be quite vulnerable as well. So it seems to me like there's, in this collective space, there's a force which is beyond any of us individually. And something emerges, and it's like it communes with itself through us. So during this like hour and a half or however long we're together, it's like this sweet, warm breeze from a mysterious origin emerges, and it moves each of us to speak and to share. And it's actually, it's quite intimate. Sometimes when we get to the end of it, I don't want it to end. It's like I'm so, my heart is so full from this way of sharing that it it's like it brings tears to my eyes at times. And so it's it's beyond self, but it's extremely intimate. So I guess that's how I'd present it.
Beautiful, Randine. I love soaking into everything you said. And one thing that I want to mention is in what you're describing, what I hear is an invitation for interaction and dialogue inside a sacred world. That, many spiritual traditions are focused on awakening to their true nature, this discovering of wisdom, this discovering of this kind of timeless, boundless, loving dimension of being. And what I hear you inviting is that we're asking the question, how do we do that together? So that we're able to pierce through those veils of what it seems like is happening into the deeper sacred blooming that is happening in this whole. Well, anyway, thank you for opening that for us.
Okay, so the topic for tonight, which I'll introduce in a little bit in the context of Chinese medicine, and then Lori's going to elaborate it a little bit in the teachings of, from the perspective of Jean Gebser, one of the founders of the integral perspective. The topic for tonight is listening and the role of listening in medicine. And in this regard, I'll just note that today is both Leon Hammer and Jean Gebser's 100th birthday. It's Leon's 100th birthday, and he was born the same day as Jean Gebser, right? Who died in the 1950s, so he'd probably be like 140 by now, or 50 or 60 or something, right? But they share the same birthday, which is a revelation to me. And very much from the perspective of the Shenhammer tradition, which both Vansanthi, Will, and I are part of, taking pulses, which was a central aspect of Leon's teaching, is just listening. And it's listening from the greatest depth of ourself to the greatest depth of the patient. So on the outside of it, of course, there's 50 to 100 different qualities and 50 to 60 places to put your fingers, and a lot of information to know about physiology. So on the outside of it, there's a lot of knowledge, but it always impressed me that as I was learning that knowledge, and I'd be getting my fingers in the right places and at the right pressure, and identifying the qualities and knowing what the qualities mean, and in the context of the other qualities, out of nowhere, a voice would just say, ask about their mother. And I remember seeing a young woman actually at a school I was teaching at, I think down in New Jersey. And they had brought in a patient, and I touched her wrist, and the voice had asked about her mother. I said, is something going on with your mother? She said she died last week. It's something comes in from beyond the mind, from the deepest well of being, from the deepest well of the self. And listening in this way at first is quite shocking and easy to discount, but in time, I think it teaches us to be able to identify a voice inside of ourselves that is ultimately trustworthy. And listening from that voice within ourselves allows us to find that dimension of, to listen from that to that in our patients. And so listening, of course, is the purvey in the context of Chinese medicine of the small intestine 19, Tinggang, listening palace. And the small intestine is the closest associate of the heart. And listening from the depth of one's heart, from the depth of self, to the depth of another, beyond all of the goings on of the complexity in the mind and of the world, this type of listening is born of love. And so I'm just going to read two quotes from the tradition. The first is from Chuang-Tzu. He says, "Don't listen with your ears, listen with your mind. No, don't listen with your mind, listen with your spirit. Listening stops with the ears. The mind stops with recognition, but spirit is empty and waits on all things. The way gathers in emptiness alone. Emptiness is the fasting of the mind." And then we have another quote from the Dan Shu, the book of an alchemical text, the book of the elixir. And it says the hen can hatch her eggs because the hen's heart is always listening. The hen can hatch her eggs because of the qi from heat. But the qi of the heat can only warm the shells that can't penetrate into the interior. Therefore, she conducts this qi inward with her heart. This she does with listening. In this way, she concentrates her whole heart. When the heart penetrates, the qi penetrates, and the chick receives the qi of the heat and begins to live. Therefore, a hen, even at times when she leaves her eggs, always has the attitude of listening with bent ear. Thus, the concentration of the spirit is never interrupted. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Lonny. You have to turn your mic on, Lorie.
So that you can listen. So I'm deeply touched and moved by what you three have spoken, and what I want to bring forth. I'm very grateful to have this space to honor a person who I really consider one of my very great teachers, although I never met him in an embodied way, who is Jean Gebser. And I had the sense that he wanted to kind of be here tonight on his birthday. He's very present with me. He was born August 20th, 1905, and he actually would be 114 today. 114, he died in 73. So, you know, it's hard to describe who he was. He was a visionary, he was a philosopher. He was illuminated by a spiritual encounter with Sri Aurobindo. He lived through World War I, World War II. But what I want to say here is that he was a pioneer, and he was a visionary pioneer in this domain of consciousness evolution. And his book, The Ever-Present Origin, which was published in 49 in German and 84 in English, is really what I consider a seminal text in my own work. And I've been studying it for over 25 years now. And it is that kind of book. But that book gave me the language and the concepts I've been looking for to place Chinese medicine in a larger context, in the context of the evolution, not just of something that could fix someone's ankle sprain or low back pain or even IBS, but that could transform the consciousness of the patients, which I knew. And Lonny and I were kind of on this parallel path of like, what are we doing here? It's more than what, the People's Republic is actually delivering, so much more. And this book, The Ever-Present Origin, gave me a language and concept to see that placement. So again, I'm grateful to be able to speak this here. And in addition, it gave me a philosophical foundation for this kind of internal belief that consciousness has an entelechy, that despite appearances to the contrary that look like human beings are like intent on blowing themselves up or like returning to some really primal state of mess, that there's something going on and we're part of it. And our engagement in this evolution matters profoundly, that consciousness is alive and it's asking something of us as practitioners and of explorers, and with each needle that we place. So also what I want to speak to is that Gebser actually developed the concept of integrality, of integral consciousness, that was adapted and further developed by Ken Wilber, and actually the central word in what we call ourselves, the Integral Chinese Medical Collective. Because one of the things we come together to do is to erupt integrality in the present moment through our conversations. And Randine, you spoke to that so beautifully, to come together as one heart and one mind without losing our individual perspectives. This is a whole new way of being together. And it's the kind of central idea of the intersubjective dialogue. By bringing together our perspectives, we catalyze a shared field to support the present emergence of a different kind of awareness. So as we prepare for our conversation of listening, I wanted to just bring a couple of further reflections from Gebser himself in the book. So for Gebser, listening, when it's through the ears, like listening with our ears, is a kind of magical way of being. It relates to the vibration of sound on the drum, on the inner drum. And so incantation and prayer come as a kind of vibrational experience in the eardrum. And on that level, our words have a magical effect. And we know that's true in the treatment room. In a certain sense, words at this level carry power, the capacity of saying to make it so. And one of the things that's been so clear to me is how important it is to remember that when we speak, that the word is a needle at this level. But when we take this listening beyond the ear and into an integral experience, we're listening from the heart. We're no longer just listening with that drum of vibration. We're listening moves from the magical ear to the integral heart, where sound, where listening resonates through our entire being, our body, our soul, and our spirit. And it becomes then what Gebser makes up these wonderful words. And the word I wanted to bring is syneresis, that listening becomes a capacity to bring together all facets of our awareness into a direct and immediate presencing of the moment. And that is an experience of what he calls volition or truth. It's like what Lonny spoke to in that listening. And time collapses there because even though he had no conscious way of knowing that this patient's mother had died the week before, somehow through listening from the heart, we know beyond space and time. And what we're doing here together is learning to experience fruition or truth when all perspectives are present simultaneously in what our ancient Taoist teachers might call virtue. Day. So here we go. I invite you all, the six of us and all of you who will join to listen in this way, to open to the palace and see what the integral field is bringing us about this incredible gift, our capacity to listen from the heart.
The extraordinary invitation of the opening that the four of you've presented here. And it's remarkable to engage. But I have to pause for a moment because I'm reminded of my my youngest daughter some 15 years ago. I asked her, what does it mean to listen? And she says, it means you do what I tell you to do. But and so and that's often what people have as an experience of being heard, is if that's actually the response. Whereas in fact, the autonomy and agency of the human soul is well, of course, beyond that matter. And then the question becomes something along the lines of, well, who's listening? And what are they listening to? And so much of our listening comes, of course, through the seven po, the orifices of the awakening of the presence in a human form. And that experience is probably classified by Pythagoras as musica humanus, the human being experience of the vibratory frequencies of life, whatever their spectral presencing are. And then but there's musica mundanus, which is the cosmos, the sounds of the cosmos, and their presencing. And then, of course, the tools of what we do, the musica instrumentalis, whether it's a needle or fire, blood, herbs. These things all are part of the listening as we see the soul before us engage in that communication. They're listening of us and that communication. But there's another level of that, which in India is called the shabd, and the shabd is the the sound of the universe at large, and that surat shabd, which is that sound that comes in the meditative experience where there is a spiritually awakened state, and that offers itself as a pathway of travel in spirit amongst the celestial masters at times, and then of course amongst our ancestors at other times, and our teachers down through the millennia as they visit upon us when we have the privilege of opening to listening.
I love that question of, what's listening and what are we listening to? And in the context of that resounding melody, that is the creative power within everything. What occurs to me is this notion around, at some level, that listening from the heart, everything is calling us home. Every shriek, every car noise, every sort of syllable that says I love you or I hate you. There's this way in which that melody, that deep melody that you're talking about, that's pulling us towards origin, is doing so at all times, at all places, in every moment, through every vibration that's ever uttered by any sentient or non-sentient thing, as the whole beckoning us. And there's this invitation, again, this notion of these layers of discovering this wisdom, this deeper nature. It's like, what does it mean for us to listen deeply enough to hear that call to bloom together as one cosmos, sort of exploring what it means to return as origin that doesn't need to return, but it's also at the very same time in that play.
I was walking in the forest this morning, and this squirrel starts playing with me, making these sounds from the tree, and I started listening to the squirrel, and all of a sudden there's this orchestra, of course, of different birds and such, and the way the sky communicates, and the wind through the trees, and the scents of the forest arise. All of those ways that life invites us into the real, into the experience of being present with life. And that is the listening of the senses in their totality, such that a synesthesia emerges into a fully enlightened state.
Yeah, in higher states, or just when I put my attention on it, I mean, there is this deep, deep, profound sentience. And when I turn my attention to that, it's riveting. And then I have to ask myself, where have I been keeping my attention? What have I been paying attention to? This thought, that thought, this care, that care, and the other thing. But as you said, Will, in a state of openness, when I put my attention deeply into the sentience, there is the the experience and the understanding that life is always talking to us, telling us through everything we need to know. And it's always a question of what are we paying attention to? Where are we keeping attention? And it's interesting you mentioned your daughter, because when I started contemplating listening, I was brought back to my daughter when she was born. And that quality of a new parent with their firstborn child laying in bed, sleeping, but all through the night, there's one ear listening. Are they breathing? Are they okay? So there's a deep state of exhaustion because you've got this infant and you're exhausted and you're deeply asleep, and yet at the same time fully conscious and paying attention. And doing that, listening from that place out of the most profound care. You just really care. You're fast asleep and listening to the crib 5 feet away to make sure there's breath. And listening to that deepest breath. And I've come to appreciate that quality in life, both, you know, in the clinic, certainly listening from that place out of a profound bodhisattva care, and also just going through the day, listening behind all the chatter of people's minds and behind all the noise in my own mind, paying attention, listening from this deepest sentience. And in that sentience, there is born just the deepest, most profound care, which is why I say that this kind of listening, in my experience, is really a deep sign of love. A deepest manifestation of love is the exercise of care through listening. As that hen to the egg, or in my experience, you know, as a new parent with my child, but the cultivating over a lifetime of that kind of listening, the caring about, for instance, the effect that I'm having on those around me. And at earlier stages of development, I think, you know, my experience was I was focused on my thoughts and my emotions and my feelings, and am I getting what I want, and how am I doing, and how are things going for me? And as that quality shifts to a deeper care, through listening, there's this deep paying attention to the, you know, in the way we have in these conversations of what's being said, what's the effect that I'm having, where are the words landing, what's the response, what's being engendered here.
I just want to add about listening beyond the senses with an open heart. The pulse certainly has been instrumental in validating for me that this was a way of listening. And I think the greatest gift of the Shen Hammer pulse for me was that Shen to Shen connection, as Lonny alluded to, knowing things that you couldn't have possibly known, and knowing them so profoundly that some of the down the road paths that have opened up, even opened up to people getting pregnant maybe, and if you listen so deeply that someone was able to transgress their infertility because of whatever you were listening to, and it's quite miraculous to think that life could have come out of your listening. And like Lonny says, it's born of love, and I can relate to that in some way. That one time I had this feeling I needed to call my aunt, and it was late at night, and I decided I'd call her the next day. And the next day in the morning, as I was walking past my phone, rushing to work, I heard this soundless voice saying, it was soundless, but it said, should have called her last night, it's too late. And she had fallen. And I thought, and she lives the other side of the world. How did I, something was transmitted to me through listening, into tuning into something. And my aunt was someone I was very close to. And I think that love connected us for me to know in advance something was about to happen. And to actually hear a voice saying something, conveying it to me, was quite astounding. Just talking about listening in different ways, I have some synesthesia, so sometimes I can't quite tell if I'm listening or feeling or whatever it is. But even this house, I stood at the door and I knew I was going to buy. I hadn't seen it. I'd seen so many houses, I couldn't settle on anything. But that knowing of the heart, I think of that as a sort of a listening, tuning in to something that affirmed to me all was well, and empowered me to take action. I guess of all my senses, listening is my go-to sense, and it's listening to words, but it's beyond that. It's often beyond that, and trusting myself to know that this is real. That's what the gift of the pulse was to me, because it was a verifiable system in which I could test that and trust myself. It led to a trust of my intuition. And now I'm getting all confused a little bit about listening to intuition and listening and hearing and manifesting something.
Well, the character for listening in Chinese and intuition are etymologically related.
Yeah, I can, that I didn't know that, but I believe that.
The character does from Tao Te Ching.
Yeah.
Overtones of intuition.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm not surprised.
I have a friend who likes to say, I just work here. I just do what I'm told. And in his delivery of care in Chinese medicine, but sometimes it's helpful for me to recognize when I'm not listening, and to admit that I often don't listen, and that becomes the window of opportunity to engage that possibility of listening. That my assumption of listening becomes a barrier to the actual reality. So, some of the greatest musicians in the world on stage, the A list, let's say, of those people who live by improvisational expression and listening. What the others will say about them is that I've never felt so heard, never felt someone hear me so deeply while I was performing something. That capacity to listen becomes an engagement of the mystic yin. Which, of course, is the container for that truth to arise within the other in whatever form.
I love that. Engagement of the mystic yin. Boy, what a portal listening is. Oh, I'm thinking about, like, Lonnie, when you were talking about listening to your daughter as a baby in deep sleep. And I think about this state that's beyond. I describe it from, borrowing from the classics, like learning to see in the dark. And it's like you see completely in the dark. And from this state of darkness, there's a knowing. Or from this state of stillness, there's a hearing. And there's like this full apprehension of taking in so much that you reach the apogee of yin. There's no more receptivity left, and it has to change to its opposite. And that's the penetration. And that's where it comes, and it has an action. So when you're listening to the pulse changes, that you're inducing something by that full listening. And you know that you hardly even have to put in a needle, because you've induced a change by taking in the depths of their heart so deeply that something in your presence has already, like the hen listening to the egg, has interpenetrated, and the yang has moved something. And so it's this full receptivity where it takes it just beyond. And I also love this idea of really being present to when I'm not listening. And often, I just love that, because when I think I'm really listening, I'm usually thinking about my listening and I'm not listening at all. It's like there is this, I cease to be. I'm not the listener. I'm not the one who's listening. But I merge with the listening of the cosmos. That primordial sound is also the listening, where one becomes the other. And so my words aren't conveying it as well as I'm feeling it, but that's what happens here.
Randine, as you speak, I'm reminded of the quote I like to use from the Huangdi Yin Fujing, the Emperor's Scripture, the Hidden Talisman, which was, of course, imminent listening, but observe the way of heaven, attend to the deeds of heaven, and that's all. And of course, the observation is the listening, always. That we then come into a dynamic which is constructed by the social systems in which we exist, whereby we're taught to record in our medical charts objective and subjective, the SOAP note, subjective, objective, and the power dynamic of the subjective is our patient's experience, and that the objective is our observation of what we see, and that becomes a shield of sorts that protects some form of primacy in knowledge and expertise holding within the engagement, which alters the terrain of potential listening and hearing and speaking. And so I just want to take this opportunity to be a voice for abandoning that idea of situating ourselves within the objective and having and believing that what we are doing and thinking and seeing as practitioners is the objective, and that we actually purchase that notion by recording it on a form in the objective section. It is entirely subjective. There's nothing about this that is objective. And if we're lucky enough to be able to listen and actually hear the person such that there's a transformation and that the lives are brought to a place of some resolution, that certain karmas are resolved in that process. There's something extraordinarily beautiful about that, which is, again, it's entirely subjective. And if I actually listened, if I actually heard the potential that there was something experienced in a way that brought about the healing in some deep, deep way, that's a precious thing to hold.
I know that one of the things my patients would comment on that struck me very early in my clinical career was, I was taught to do an hour and a half intake on all new patients. And I would generally interview people for 45 minutes to an hour. And then I would take everybody's pulses for 45 minutes. So when all the questions were done, then I would just sit there and spend 45 minutes taking the pulse. And people would just routinely comment how moving it was, that nobody had ever paid this kind of attention or listened so deeply to them before. And I really came to be interested in that kind of listening as focused attention out of care as a foundation of healing. And just another thing that comes up for me is the relation, listening as an act of receptivity, and as a listening as a deep invitation to being changed and being moved. Opening myself up, on the one hand, as we said in the beginning, life is always talking to us, every moment telling us what we need to know. And on the other hand, there's an aspect in myself of providing the invitation and saying, let me know what I'm not seeing. Let me know what isn't here. Sometimes life is calling for a response. And history is coming up. History and conditioning. And I know I don't want to respond to this the way I've responded 10,000 times in the past. And I don't literally know what to do. But I just know I don't want to do I don't want to act out of habit. And I don't want to do something that's comfortable. So there's a willingness to live in not knowing and in the unknown, and to provide an invitation and just say, I don't know what to do, but I'm open. And just in creating that openness, like sitting with that, and sometimes it takes a minute and sometimes it can take weeks. Well, deep, deep currents move. And there's just an openness and a listening and allowing those currents to move until all of a sudden something comes and like, okay, I see. I get it. And it's not something that's arrived at with the mind weighing things. It's just a deep openness in the heart and a willingness to be changed by what comes. And that can be scary. But it's also at critical junctures often the only time forward, if something's going to be new, if something's going to change.
I think of the the master that's content with the low places like water. And all of this that we're talking about, like going back to the idea of our objectivity as doctors, and we are the ones who are imparting this healing to the patient who's downstream from us, and to kind of flip that around and go into that lower place, the unknowing, the yin beneath, where instead of having any answers, where I know nothing, that's when the wisdom can come and give me something that I never could have thought of on my own. And so that, when I was, teaching practitioners a lot that were out in practice, there was kind of an affront to their egos when I'd said, the best thing that we can do is to reside in that place of not knowing and get all of that knowledge base out of there, and to sit in those low places until the whatever needs to happen happens. But boy, we have to get out of that healer role. It's beneath that. I can't be the healer when I'm in that place. It's that, who's listening, who's healing. There's a power then that can move through that receptivity that can't move through when I know what to do, when I'm repeating habitual things that have worked in the past that might not work on this patient.
Well, that seems like that's Ming, the fulfillment of destiny. It's like, can I listen to that voice that's emanating from origin? Can I listen to how that celestial melody is in a process of becoming? Am I able to listen to that in such a way that I can recognize the stamp? I can recognize the signature gesture of the one gesture that never breaks. And am I able to listen to that? And then I'm doing what I'm told, right? Right? It's like if I'm able to listen closely enough and I fall into that, then I become the sort of spontaneous expression and delight of that voice, that resounding melody from, emanating from origin. And then it's like fulfillment of destiny is occurring in every moment, because there's a relationship with, there's like this image, like a piece of jade that's like broken, and then the emperor keeps one piece of jade, and then one of the people that work for them get the other piece of jade, and it's like those pieces fit together, right? And you carry it with you, and there's like that insignia, that stamp of origin. And my sense is that when we're listening deeply in the way that everyone's pointing to, we're able to recognize that quality of resonance between the stamp that's like, living in our often seemingly separate existence of an individual, tumbling through the world. There's a moment that we can feel that resonance, that we actually were never separated from that great gesture, the Mahamudra. And then all of a sudden, yeah, the listening and the doing is inseparable from origin becoming. And then we're fulfilling destiny in every moment, with every bat of the, I was gonna say bat of the ear, and with every blink of the ear, we're just a fulfillment of that. Yeah.
Well, destiny in that sense of Ming are heavenly orders. And Will had said before about attending to heaven. And the Chinese character Fu for talisman has, you know, half, it's torn in half and half exists in heaven, and then we have the other half, right? So it's the mandate.
I've been very present to the field that we've co-created in this conversation, and it feels very deep and rich and very woven with, I mean, a tremendous amount of, I can feel the depths of embodied experience, you know, that we've all had over many, many years of presencing in this way. And, you know, that play between the deep receptivity of real listening, reaching its enantiodromia, and actually just of itself becoming a penetration, and how many of our patients will say, you know, like you said, Lonnie, like other people have said, that just being listened to, whether we're listening to the pulse, you know, through the ears of the fingers that develop, like our fingers develop ears over years and years of doing this work. But also the kind of listening when we listen to the voice, you know, over years and years, and you can actually listen in a way that detaches from content and meaning and becomes a purely, you know, an immersion in an energetic stream, and being attuned to the directionality and the quality of that stream. So all of this is happening for me as I'm listening. But then I have to say, Will, I keep hearing your little one, like she hasn't left for me, you know, saying, what is listening? Listening is when you do what I tell you to do. Because I feel like I was so struck by that, because that's what Gebser meant by she was living in magical consciousness when she said that. And rightly so, you know, she was at that magical stage where, so mote it be, I say, and if it doesn't happen, there's something wrong. What went wrong here in the communication? And then I heard it again with your friend who said, I just work here because I'm just listening to the mandate. But so I wanted to just say that's been very present for me. And I do think there are moments in the treatment room when our patients are talking to us like that, you know, that there's not a reciprocity in the field, when there's actually a demand, you know, which can thrust us back into that dualism or that subject objectivity, you know, where you can feel in the field presence, like, whoa, I can't even hardly listen in the way I want to listen because I'm being so commanded, you know, because I need to listen in this way. You know, I'm not yet able to enter into an integral shared field. So being able to, in that way, I think being present to our own, whether it's resistance or a kind of bending the knee to that level of command, which is also a kind of listening, you know, and a gradual, like the healing becomes developmental almost like we have to develop into what we're talking about here. So I think because I am so immersed in these structures and how they're all ever present, as everyone's saying, like that what your daughter brought, that we have to make room for that too. Listening is when you do what I say. And of course, who's that I, then, because we're also saying that same I that is alive in her is the same, is, in a certain way, some other kind of guiding voice that we listen to when we know, for example, that someone's mother died last week, or Vansanthi, like you said, where you were there was a voice, saying, do it now. How can we recognize when that voice, there's a kind of learning or recognition of like, listen and do what I say. When it's not about, a fascist kind of demand, but an actual volition, like there's truth here. And how do we learn that distinction? I guess that's the small intestine, that discernment, that listening palace capacity to know the pure from the impure, and then deliver what's the finest, purest truth to the heart.
Oh, yeah, go on.
Into intention. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, the Chinese character for listen, it literally means the heart of the disciple being rectified through attentive listening to the master, to the teacher, having the heart rectified through listening, and intuition and original nature restored by listening attentively to the words of the master, and the master in this case is origin. It's the heart anatomically and physiologically, but beyond that, it's origin. And on the outside, I mean, the small intestine needs to literally hear what the emperor's saying, but the quality of listening that we're all alluding to is listening beyond all those words, and even beyond the intentions, because the intentions might be egoic intentions based on fears and desires, and being able to hear the self, capital S. So there's so much complexity and so many parts to the self, but to be able to listen from the self, capital S, or Shen, capital S, to the self, or Shen, capital S, and just never lose sight of that. That's what I find most moving and most compelling. And it's, I've had people get disarmed. If you just ask a person, how are you? And then actually listen from the place I'm talking about, people can be shocked. They get disarmed. They're not used to it. They think you're being too intense. They'd rather have a pleasantry or just say things are good. And I've had, when I've sat with people and I've said, how are you? And then I look in their eyes and they don't know what's going on. What's happening here? There's I think what I'm saying, what I'm alluding to here is the relationship between listening, union, and as profound intimacy. Because what's listening is what's speaking, and there's just one thing. And there's so much, the ego has so many defenses built up to maintain separation that it's disarmed by listening in this way.
Well, and it's like getting, it's getting to the heart of it. You know, that's why patients will come in and they'll sit down and then they blame you for making them cry. They're like, how come every time I come in here in 2 seconds I'm crying? There's no like crazy stuff happening behind the curtain here. It's like there's just listening to the heart of it, listening to the heart of the pain, but also listening to the heart of that deep resounding goodness that's ever present. And that relationship between listening and virtue and you know, getting to the heart of it. It's like, are we gonna settle for like, oh, we live in a world that's filled with hate? You know, like, is that really what's going on? Are we living in a world where people are just mean or everyone disagrees, and like, are we going to settle for that level of truth? Or is there a possibility to listen to the heart of things? And then underneath that, there's deeply good intentions, even where at some level there's malintent. You know, if we listen deeply enough. I do a lot of parts work with people, and it's always the case. The meanest parts that are in their head, telling them the worst things with so much intensity. If you know how to talk to those parts and listen to the heart of who they are, they stop. They say, oh, I was being really mean to this person because I wanted to protect them. I didn't want them to succeed or go out in the world because I'm afraid that if they succeeded for a little while and went out into the world, then they would fail. And then they would realize that once and for all, they were a terrible person. This is the part that was just cursing at this person in their head for years. And you listen to the heart and you know, and that heart of listening, it knows without a shadow of a doubt that underneath everything, there's enlightened intention. There's deep, deep, deep goodness that's resounding from origin. And with that listening and the speaking to that, it's like shining the beam on that and coaxing out that. The hatred uncoils. The meanness starts to unravel, and it discovers its own nature through that sort of dual experience of listening and speaking to the heart of things.
Mm. My dog's making lots of noises here that you can probably hear if you're listening.
You know, I want to speak to that a bit, Alexander, in bringing it into the actuality of presence in the treatment room. How there are times where it feels like you're having to listen underneath or in between what people may be actually speaking, and how we learn to listen like that. What I want to say about that is that I've my awareness is that it requires a certain kind of dual listening. Like we have to be, or maybe even a 3-part listening, actually, because in order to actually know whether what I'm hearing, I have to also be listening to how it's landing in my heart, so I'm listening to my own body response. I'm listening to what is kind of emergent in the dialogue between me, just like I'm doing right here, right now. Like I'm listening to all of you. I'm listening to your voices, all of which are very familiar and very dear to me. You know, we've been doing this a long time, so I hear your voices. that immediately affects my nervous system. You know, I'm listening somewhat to the content, and then I'm listening for that sort of transcendent or larger than all of us wisdom or voice, or, you know, and that's the question of like, how do we hear all of that? How do we learn to listen to all of that simultaneously? And that's, in a certain sense, integral. You know, it's these multiple levels of awareness. And I'm going to use a Gebser word here, that they become diaphanous, that we can see through the levels at the same time. So the, you know, my self, or, you know, what's happening in me as an identity with a perspective and an experience, what's happening between me and all of you as I listen to each of you, and then what's emergent here as we are in this listening together. You know, and that could also be in a dyadic relationship when I'm in the room with a patient. But of course, I'm presencing to it here right now.
I'm continually brought back to this groundless space of being, and a sensitivity to what Lonny and Randine were speaking about, not knowing that something emerges in that groundless space of being, in that not knowing, whereby an actual moment of listening can occur, and it's profound. And I'm amazed at, you know, just how long we can sustain this as a way of being. It's pretty remarkable. It's not common at the coffee shop, you know.
It depends who you hang with, baby.
That's right.
That's why this is so delightful. It's so fulfilling. It's so nourishing.
And of course, it's so, I'm going to skip one of the words that's coming to me just because we're recording, but it is so radical. It is so radical. I mean, it's radically transformational.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think of the necessity that, all of us have had years of cultivation and inner work ourselves. And that is such a necessary part of this. To be able, like when I was listening to you, Alexander, talking about, beneath the hatred or whatever these parts are, that there's some element of goodness that shines through, that at the deepest place there's love. If we have the ability to tune into that, to tune that small intestine lens into where that goodness is. But if the ego is responding to the demand of the patient to make me pregnant, whatever it is, and I have a higher desire to please them, than I do to bring them to the place of truth where they might never be with child, then I can't be in the healing place with them because I've defaulted to their, because I'm trying to give them what they want, rather than opening up to what their destiny is. And their destiny might be to not have a child, to not get well, to die, and to be able to go to those low places and find the goodness there, to find the love there, and to help them walk through that.
You know, Randine, I think you just got at it. The piece that I was circling around about listening is that you do what I say, and how sometimes that comes at us in our engagement with the patient. That the patient is actually living at the level of consciousness that Will's little one, you know, that they're living in the magical level, that here you are, and your job is to do what I say. And you so beautifully spoke to how we need, you know, through our own inner cultivation, to detach from a reactive response to that, either by, you know, refusal or irritability of that demandingness, or, you know, what so many of us have to learn to not do, which is to think we have to fix it. You know, if I don't do what they say, I'm failing. And what I'm aware of, and I think that was one of the reasons I kept coming back to it, is that through not engaging with the listening in that way, that because you tell, you know, my listening to you is that I do what you say, or I do what you will, or I, you know, I fix it for you, but rather to listen to what is being spoken from that other place, you know, that I'm still just working here, you know, I'm still just listening to the mandate, but to make the distinction between what's actually being spoken in the room. Like you said, it may, you know, it may not be a pregnancy at all. It may be a work of art. It may be, you know, a relationship. It may be an illness. It may be a death, you know, and to be able to just be able to listen like that.
What's really interesting, and I had a glaring example of this recently, but what's really interesting is when we do listen from a great depth to a great depth in a patient, their ego's perspective can often be, you're not listening. Because we're not paying attention to the fears and desires of the ego. I mean, we can hear them and we can hold them as part of the totality of the whole thing, but we're listening to something much, much deeper. And what Randine said, the first half of what you said last time you spoke, Randine, was, of course, we all have so many, not just years, but decades and decades of cultivation. Decades and decades and decades of cultivation. And I thought to myself, that's true. And where it gets us is to the point where we can just walk to the edge of the precipice and be interested in taking the next step. And in that, there's an emptiness and there's a not knowing. And all those years of cultivation, really, where do they get you? They get you to a point of having an empty heart capable of receiving and having interest. Not to some point of master, you know, not in the sense of all this technical knowledge and this, that, and the other thing, and all these cities and capabilities and all these mythic capacities or whatever, but really the decades and 40 years we have, right? Many of us have 40, 50 years of actually being on the path, and gets you to a point where you can just drop everything and listen with interest because you want to know. You're into you just want to see what happens. So we're coming on time. So if anybody has a concluding something to say, or
Well, when you spoke, Lonnie, of going to the edge of the cliff, and it struck a chord in me. And of course, the fool's journey. He's walking off the cliff there, and that place where there's actually no listener, even that dissolving into the field of the experience, that the heart of the matter, as Alexander said, it's not located within us. It's a patient-centered experience.
It reminds me of like I used to, we've heard of like words like the omniscient Lord, like that kind of language. And I never quite related to, like, there's some, I couldn't really relate to some dude that's just sitting there knowing everything, right? And then at some point it occurred to me, oh, that's not what all knowing means. It means that the knowing presence, that which hears anything ever, that which ever could know ever, is non-local. It's not situated inside here, but not outside there. It's located everywhere. It's a non-local totality of a field where we can sense over there with the thing that we think we're perceiving. We can feel the knowing presence with the thing we're perceiving, that it's an illusion in some ways, that it's just coming through my eyes and my ears, while also there is a nervous system supporting the capacity for all this. But that all-knowing, all-pervading, all-listening presence, it's everywhere.
and it doesn't know anything in particular.
And it doesn't know anything in particular.
It's interested.
Exactly.
And you're actually happening inside me right now. Like Peter and I'm happening inside you.
Yeah, because there's only one damn thing that's all pervasive and all knowing.
That's
We got these like
listening.
wiggling little coats.
I think we're done here.
Beautiful.
Wow.
If this was a jam session, I wanted it the sound, the cosmic sound or the soundless sound would be the music.
That's the intention. I'm going to stop the recording.